now I'd like to introduce you to our guest. Julie Owens became a victim advocate after surviving domestic violence, attempted murder. For 3 decades, she has consulted and trained nationally and internationally for organizations, governments, and professionals. She created a domestic violence crisis team for ERs and a transitional shelter before directing DV trauma therapy research at the National Center for PTSD. She has coordinated DV services in a YMCA or YWCA and county mental health department, as well as developed a shelter program for victims who are elderly, disabled, or undocumented, and those with mental health or addiction challenges. For 9 years, she oversaw victim service agencies in a large region of North Carolina. Julie has served as an expert witness for many years. She consults and trains independently for organizations, including the Office for Victims of Crime, the National Human Trafficking Center, and Bank of America. Her focus is survivor-centered, trauma-informed victim advocacy in secular and faith-based settings. Julie, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. I appreciate the kind invitation. It's great to be back with you and all the participants at the conference. Thank you to those of you who've joined us today.
Yes. So just to reiterate, please ask questions in the Q&A box. And until we get that box filled up, Julie, is there anything that you wanted to just kind of bring to the attention of the attendees here? It's maybe something that you're working on or something that you got cooking in the pot?
Well, I'm officially retired, but I continue to consult and train and do some expert witness work, not a lot. There is an expert witness case that I'm involved with that involves a very brutal attempted murder of a woman in her workplace. And that's something that is, currently on the front burner. In addition to that, I do a bit of writing and am finally getting started on a book or two that I've had in mind for a long time and really hadn't been able to get around to. So I'm doing that and just doing a lot of consulting. And for example, there is a study that I'm a bit involved with as an advisor at the University of North Carolina, looking at e-filing of protective orders and how that's going in the state. And
that's a big topic right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I never know what's going to come my way. Actually, I had several trainings that were lined up before COVID-19 took hold the way it did, and those have either gone virtual or I've had to back out of them. And that mostly involves training advocates. One is around substance use and mental health issues with victims and survivors. I think that's a really important area that we need to address, and that I think many advocates and programs, especially those in rural areas or that have very limited budgets for training and so forth, haven't been able to really address in a way that they would like to. And so looking at some of the things that are being done around the country by programs to address those co-occurring issues is something that I spend a lot of time examining and responding to.
Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna throw out some questions that attendees have sent outside of this window that we're in now, but wanted to ask of you, and hopefully that'll spark some conversation from our attendees. So you have talked about wanting professionals to stop using the term cycle of abuse.
Yes.
Could you speak more about that and why you disagree with the terminology?
Well, I think that, I used it for many, many years, most of my career actually. And as a survivor, I did relate to it. But what I think I understand now better than I ever have is how there really never is well, there's certainly never a honeymoon. And I guess I should just start by saying that the cycle that you're referring to is the theory that Dr. Lenore Walker put forward, I believe it was in the 70s. She actually coined the term battered woman. And she said that there's three phases, and most of the clients that she had worked with in therapy, and that was tension building, where the couple spent most of their time, the violence or the tension was escalating. Then there would be an explosion, after which there would be the violence would subside, and there would be what she called a honeymoon period. And then it would, kind of all start again, and each of those explosions would be worse than the last. And it's not that it's completely irrelevant by any means, but what's important to me is that because we understand much better about coercive control in the non-physical forms of domestic violence these days, not just what abusers do to their victims, but the freedoms they take from them and the ways in which they take control of their lives and dictate everything. I think it's important to understand that there really isn't a honeymoon, that all of those phases of the cycle are abuse, and that abuse pervades every aspect of a victim's life, even though it may not be overt or physical abuse that's occurring at a particular time. And I think the word honeymoon is particularly problematic because it's not a honeymoon. Honeymoons don't follow violence. That's why I also have a problem with terms like love bombing. You hear that a lot in relationship to what many people refer to as narcissistic abuse. It's not love bombing, it's manipulation bombing. And I call that period, rather than the honeymoon, the period of manipulative kindness, which is a term that I was taught by an advocate who worked with me as a survivor, and I think it's much more accurate. So there may be patterns that victims recognize, but also depending on their culture and how they have been raised and their the society in which they live, the cycle may not be something that every person relates to or every victim relates to. So, those are some of the reasons why I think it's important to focus more on the power and control wheel and the continuum of violence, which is the trajectory, the fact that it continues to escalate in frequency and severity over time. It doesn't go backwards.
Manipulative kindness. I like that. I have to admit, I have not heard that terminology before. Is there someone out in the field who uses that term quite frequently, maybe in their work, that we could look up?
Me.
You?
Probably the only one that uses it, but I've used it forever. And I learned it from my advocate, Luana Neary, when I was in a support group. And I've used it forever because that's what it is. It is manipulation. Even though it may be as good as it gets, that, those promises, those sweet words, those gifts or whatever that may come after a particularly bad incident of abuse, that period in which the person who's doing the abusing tries to convince the victim not to leave, or beg, or begs for forgiveness, promises to go to counseling, all of that. Because they don't have any intention of really giving up control, it is more manipulation than it is any kind of a genuine, it's not change. If it were, then it wouldn't keep occurring over and over again and escalating in frequency and severity. And I think this is a thing that victims often, because they may be traumatically bonded, as we talked about in my webinar, they, because it's as good as it gets, they bond to that side of the abuser, and they start to see that as genuine and to experience the relief that they get from the abuse stopping, at least temporarily, as gratitude. And it becomes their reality because they start to see things through his eyes. And they don't necessarily experience it or understand it as manipulation. And Neil Jacobson and John Gottman, who did great longitudinal research at the University of Washington, they were sociologists, found that the victims who were with the most dangerous abusers would never leave until their pity turned to contempt. And that cannot happen until a victim begins to see through that manipulation and understand it for what it is.
Oh my gosh, Julie. So yesterday, she works in the Dallas DA's office, Alyssa Webb. She had a case study, and that's exactly what she said about this woman who had been abused for years. I mean, violently abused and coerced and manipulated by her boyfriend. And it just got to a point where the pity did turn into contempt, and then she started to find her voice in the court and communicating with her probation officer and things like that. So I love to hear when one of our wonderful experts is talking about one thing and it coincides with what another expert has already mentioned. So I love when that aligns.
Right. And it's interesting when survivors actually learn about this, and I think this is the power of advocacy. We can teach victims that we're working with who are still stuck about how to gauge the genuineness or lack thereof in some of these behaviors. And when they can start to somehow be a little more objective, step back a little bit and try to examine the motives of the abuser, they may start to see some of this, and maybe some of that trauma bonding will get to crack a little bit. And certainly if they are able to be in a support group with other survivors who can reflect back to them or reality check, that's very helpful, because it's that isolation that makes it so easy for all of that gaslighting and brainwashing to trick a victim into believing that this is good, that this is genuine, that he really, is changing or wanting to change. But once we can help them understand that these are the things you look for if someone is actually changing, and it's not what they say, it's what they do.
Absolutely. Misty has a question. As a probation officer, when she goes to home visits with the perpetrators and the spouse, also the victim, is present, is there any behaviors that she can watch for from her? Okay, so are there any behaviors that she can watch for from her to help her be more aware of situations that she may not be able to verbally express? And are there any particular behaviors on the part of him, the offender, that indicate that there is more than what is being said? And I can read that again if
No, I understand the question, and it's a real dilemma for people like Misty and social workers and others who have to go into the home, and you've got the abuser and the victim right there together. And what happens in a situation like that is, of course, the victim can't tell the truth. The victim has been already grilled and threatened and intimidated and told exactly what they can and can't do or say. So they're not going to tell the truth, because if they do, they're really going to get hurt. And so they are, going to make it appear like everything is fine and there's no problem. It's hard to read through that. Sometimes what I have seen is the abuser does all the talking, and the partner, may be looking down, looking away, or watching him and for cues and clues, and you can see that. it's really dangerous to try to interview them in the same room. If you don't have a choice and your job calls for that, then you do have a difficult task. I definitely agree. If I don't believe that victims are going to tell the truth most of the time, because they definitely will be, there will be retaliation as soon as the door shuts and you're gone, Misty. And I'm sure you know that. Abusers, because they don't feel guilt typically, and believe that they're justified in what they do and feel very entitled, are not going to have any insight. And so trying to, convince them that what they're doing is wrong is probably not going to be very successful. And that's why groups for, abuser intervention, batterer intervention groups are really the gold standard, when they can be held accountable by others who do the same thing, and by facilitators who are skilled. But sometimes abusers, of course, will speak for the victim, as I said. A lot of times, if the victim is not, her first language isn't English, the abuser will make you believe that she doesn't even speak or understand English, even though she may. So if there's any way possible, of course, to interview them separately, not together at the same time in the same room, obviously that is ideal. But I would say I would not be too, I would not want to base my assessment on whether or not this person is dangerous on whatever I see when they are together, because I think you will not see what's really going on there. So that's the tough part, unless you can give the victim complete confidentiality and speak with her. I'm saying her, it's usually a her, but not always, in a way that the abuser doesn't know you're talking to her. I don't think you're really going to get at the truth of what's really happening, and you won't get it from the children either, because everybody has been really indoctrinated, and they are good little soldiers, and they're not going to talk about the abuse, but because it's too dangerous.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another attendee who asked the question. Can you tell us more about the crisis centers you created at the emergency rooms? He or she is curious about this, as they have a lot of clients tell them that they would go to the hospitals because of physical abuse, but would not tell doctors there of the abuse at all.
Well, it's kind of the same thing, because a lot of times, if not most times, victims are taken there by their abusers, because that's who controls their life. Remember, when we talk about domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, we're talking about coercive control most of the time, and that is somebody who's essentially living as a hostage, living under siege, even though you can't see it. So they're not controlling anything. A lot of times they're not even, able to drive themselves somewhere. Not always, but a lot of times. And certainly if they have injuries from abuse, the abuser is typically not going to let them seek care. If they do, they're going to be right there with them. So my experience and why I started the crisis team that I did was because I had that experience. Not that my abuser was with me, but I had been, when I filed for divorce, my abuser came back and broke in and waited and ambushed me and my father, and before my father got home, beat me and held me at knife point, and then we both ended up being stabbed. And so when we went to the emergency room, they didn't even talk to me about domestic violence. They didn't know what to say to me, basically. They took care of my physical needs, put me in a room. I was hospitalized, and nobody ever talked to me about while I was there. And I didn't want anybody else to have that experience. So I ended up developing this crisis team. This was made up of survivors who were healed, but who wanted to help others, and they were on call. So mine was a community-based crisis team. We weren't attached to a particular hospital, but we responded to calls from hospitals and healthcare centers and medical settings. And I did all of the training, often in concert with the medical association or physician, so that the healthcare folks would know how to identify the signs. Because one of the signs is the person comes in with some kind of injury, and their partners with them and won't leave their side. And so part of the protocol is always to try to separate them and tell the person that the policy is the patient must be seen privately first, and you will need to wait out here, sir, et cetera, that kind of a thing. So there are different models nowadays. This was back in the 90s. Now, most programs that are doing this kind of thing and responding to victims in emergency departments are hospital-based. So there will be maybe one hospital in a city, for example, that does this specifically. And so if a victim happens to go to that hospital, they're very lucky. And if that response is 24 hours, they're even luckier. But in most places, I would say, certainly in smaller towns and rural areas, there's not that kind of a response available. But what they need, and what you could do even, is train the medical and healthcare personnel how to identify the signs and symptoms, both overt and not physical, and also what to do and not do, and how to slip the information to someone that you think may be a victim in a way that is safe and not violate their confidentiality or talk to them about what's going on in front of their partner, just to be on the safe side. And it's particularly tricky with same-sex couples, because sometimes you think they're just with their best friend, and it's actually the abuser. So there's a lot to it. But there is a national healthcare conference on domestic violence that Futures Without Violence, a great organization in San Francisco, does annually, and you might want to check it out.
Julie, and also I believe I get tongue-tied. IAFN, I believe that they're also coming up with some documents to kind of address the things that you've brought up here.
Yeah,
so,
there are a number of tools that you can use to identify the signs and the symptoms and so forth. But my experience working with victims in emergency rooms is, even when we know that that's what's going on, often they will just deny it because they're too afraid to tell the truth, and they don't know what's going to happen with that information. And because many hospitals do have an internal policy, even though there may not be a mandatory reporting law for domestic violence, but if they have a policy that if we know an assault has taken place, we will report it to the police, then victims don't want to do that because they don't want to involve law enforcement, because they're concerned about retaliation for good reasons. And so it's a very important type of response that needs to be available widely, but it's one that is very nuanced, in which we could do more harm than good if we don't know what we're doing. But I'm glad you asked that question, because it is a really good one.
Thank you for that. And Misty, thanks you for answering her question as well. And they do have a call separate. They have a call separate form for the abuser. So it was helpful for her to know what to look for as in general behaviors. Yeah. And
let me just say, Misty, and the rest of you who may have to do this, that even making phone calls or computer or text contact with the victim, you have to be extremely careful, because abusers monitor all of that. It's very difficult for a victim to be able to communicate with you in such a way that it can't be tracked or traced. And we call that stalking by technology, and it's just sort of standard behavior for, I'd say, that the majority of abusers control all that, because they don't want anybody to find out about the abuse. So if you want to know more about that, I would contact the Safety Project at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, because they have the they have the expertise and the training all on stalking by technology, which is what we call it, and the safe ways in which to communicate with victims in a way that won't endanger them.
Excellent. And I noticed that you shared a little bit about your own personal story, which is a segue to Katie's question. Can you speak to how a survivor may be experienced by domestic violence professionals if they have reached the state of contempt? Are they often re-traumatized because they are what appears to be so angry at their abuser?
Yeah, I think it backfires so often, especially in courts, particularly in family court, when you have a what's called a high conflict divorce, but really, it's domestic violence. And so often what happens is the mother, who typically is the person who has been abused, the focus ends up being on her and her anger and her demeanor and so forth and so on, because she's terrified she's going to lose custody of her children, and she is not being believed, and the abuser is so slick and manipulative, and people tend to believe him and not her, because he seems very together, because he's manipulative, and she may seem unstable. And so because it's not just in court. I mean, it can be in a situation with law enforcement, say, when they respond. I think a lot of times people say, oh, she's just an angry, she's just an angry woman. And of course, abusers, that's their whole trope. That's what they do. She's a bitch, she's crazy, she's psycho. We'll look at her, she's an alcoholic or whatever. And so because they are so good at denigrating her and trying to convince people that she's the problem, so often that's what happens in systems. They end up just kind of forgetting that you have an abuser here, even when they have evidence, and focusing instead on her and what she's doing, and the fact that and how she's responding to the abuse. But that's just the normal response. Many victims don't have anger for a long time because it's not safe to be angry, and they learn to suppress that in order to cope and survive and to get along and try to not provoke, which they believe they can do. And so I think that anger can be very healthy. Anger is just a feeling. It's not good or bad. It just is. We all have it. It's normal. But I think sometimes when victims act out in ways that injure their abusers, they are even more misunderstood. And I would say probably as many as 1/4 of all the victims I've worked with in the many decades I've done advocacy work have been arrested themselves as an abuser. Yeah. Because people who are working in law enforcement, the system, often don't know how to tell the difference between an abuser and a victim. That's one of the things that I really like to train folks on, is how do you tell the difference between an abuser and a victim, And if you can't, then you might just think the person who is causing the other one to bleed, is the abuser. And that's not necessarily true, because victims use what we call resistive violence, or they try to protect themselves and defend themselves, which may injure the abuser. And so that's not necessarily anger, that's self-defense, but it's often misinterpreted. And so I think a lot of things victims do to survive is misinterpreted and used against them, whether it is fighting back or defending themselves, resisting the violence, whether it is drinking to numb the pain and cope, whether it is looking outside the relationship, maybe meeting a nice man who treats her well and getting involved with him. I don't think that happens a whole lot because it's too dangerous, but if it were to, I think the kinds of things that victims do to survive, which they never would have done if they hadn't been being abused, often from the outside looking in, people will make judgments about her. We'll look at her, she sleeps with a gun under her pillow. She's paranoid. She yells at her kids. She smells like alcohol. She screws around on him. she hits him, no wonder he beats her, kind of thing. And this is why it's so important to understand victims and why they do what they do, and coercive control, and abusers and why they do what they do, and to not just look at domestic violence or intimate partner abuse in an overly simplistic way.
Yeah.
It's very nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I definitely can understand the inclination to use violence to prevent violence, but it definitely muddies the waters once you get into the court system. And what you were just saying reminds me of something that Oprah said. She said, we have got to get to the point where we don't say what's wrong with her, but instead say what happened to her.
And that's what we call trauma-informed care. We always need to look to the source of the behavior when we're talking about victims and survivors, because they're not who they used to be, and they're not ever going to be who they used to be. Another thing Oprah says is, you change, you become a new you. And that's true. It doesn't, because there is a certain amount of innocence, in a sense, that is lost when you become a victim of an intimate partner, someone who you trusted, who you thought loved you, who you thought had your best interests at heart, who you thought you were spending your life with. And it's easy to become jaded, and it's easy to lose the ability to trust. But helping survivors understand that is just as important as helping other people understand that, because so many survivors carry so much guilt for the things they did or didn't do, for the choices they made when really there weren't any other choices, for the things they thought, for the things they believed. And this is why the research that we did at the National Center for PTSD focused on trying to eliminate the trauma-related guilt that was really exacerbating the PTSD in survivors of domestic violence, because they would be looking back and beating up on themselves, remembering themselves somehow as having more options than they really had, or knowing more than they really did. So they might not, for example, might not understand that it was domestic violence back then, but once somebody defines it for them and they realize what it is, they look back and they go, I was so stupid. Why did I ever marry him? I shouldn't have stayed with him. I should have seen the red flags, but they didn't know what the red flags were. Mm-hmm. So, part of surviving and learning to thrive and what we call post-traumatic growth is understanding why we as victims did the things we did, what was a choice and what wasn't, what was a survival behavior, and what we had to do to be able to, make it out the other side and to be a survivor. And that sometimes that takes a long time, but that's, to me, one of the most important things we do as advocates is we try to normalize that survivor behavior and help survivors understand that even though it may not be what you did, maybe it wasn't the healthiest thing, but it was adaptive. It helped you survive. You did it for these reasons, and you really didn't have a whole lot of other choices. You couldn't walk away safely, for example. There was a door, but it's not like you could just walk away and not be followed and stalked or,
Right.
hurt worse or killed,
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that insight. Tiffany would love to hear more about how offenders who know the system can manipulate others to help him or her through court cases to get what he or she wants in divorce cases.
Well, abusers are masters of manipulation, and because they're not the one who's been living under siege, they're not the one who has been completely controlled and isolated and terrorized and threatened, they, as I said, look so much better in court. And so naturally, who are you going to think as an outsider not understanding this? Who are you going to think is the stable one, right? And as if you haven't read the book Trauma and Recovery by Dr. Judith Herman, I urge every one of you to make that a priority, because you will learn so much and understand so much about victims and survivors. And also, I think, about abusers. Of course, Lundy Bancroft's book, Why Does He Do That?, is the sort of the handbook on understanding abusers, and I think it's phenomenal as well. Those two books are just extremely important resources, I believe. But if someone has been a victim of this strategic course of oppressive behavior, as Dr. Evan Stark says, who defined the term coercive control, if they have been deprived of their rights and their liberties, and they have been completely dominated by this person, but this is not something that outsiders see, and that outsiders are only making judgments based on what there is evidence of, which is physical violence most of the time. Then abusers they're given the benefit of the doubt most of the time. And in the family courts today, sadly, abusers are likely to win custody, and if it's a contested case, because it's really kind of a stacked deck against victims. And I've seen this for decades, but it's even gotten much worse. And in fact, Dr. Joan Meyer, who is an attorney and researcher who developed the Domestic Violence LEAP, or Legal Empowerment Appellate Project at Georgetown University, has done the research and has shown that when abusers, what they do is they claim parental alienation, that is the term. And there is a junk science that is called parental alienation syndrome, PAS. It in fact doesn't exist, but still a lot of people who work in the system believe that there is such a thing as parental alienation syndrome, and that label will get slapped on to a survivor or victim who has been abused and is continuing to be manipulated by the abuser throughout this whole process in court. And so, as Judith Herman says, people are more likely to side with the abuser than they are with the victim, because siding with the abuser means you only have to do one thing, and that's nothing. But if you believe the victim, then it requires something of us, and it's a lot of work, if you will. So we have a very broken family court system right now, and that's why I'm grateful for the people like Joan Meyer, like Barry Goldstein, like many others, like organizations for protective parents that are working on trying to make change in the systems that are where victims find themselves fighting for custody of their children in particular. And the sad thing is that when victims are saddled with that parental alienation label, it is very difficult for them to win custody. And as Dr. Meyer's research has shown, and when they claim that they have been abused or the children have been abused, they're even more likely to lose custody. And when they claim that the children were sexually abused, they're even more likely to lose custody. It's the most counterintuitive, most infuriating and insane thing, but that's how it is. We live in a very victim-blaming society. People do not want to believe that they would ever be in that situation. There's something wrong with her if she's been abused, because that wouldn't happen to me. I'd be smarter than that. I wouldn't pick somebody like that. I wouldn't stay with somebody like that, et cetera, et cetera. So the victim blaming pervades all of the systems in which victims may find themselves. And so many nowadays have learned this and are avoiding systems. They don't want to get involved with law enforcement. They don't want to get involved with the court system. So sadly, many are choosing to stay with their abusers until their children are older, because they are not willing to take the chance that they're going to lose them. And it's something that that we need to understand, and we need to all be addressing. it is a national crisis.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you as you speak and answer questions, how you give out so many resources. And I believe our attendees are asking, you mentioned a book, the first book you mentioned, I think it was Why Does He Do That?
Yeah, Why
Miss,
Does He Do That
and
by
who's that
Lundy.
by?
Lundy Bancroft, who he really explains that abusers act not because they're out of control, not because they're mentally ill, not because they can't help themselves, not because they're sick, not because they have an anger problem. It's because they are entitled. They believe they have the right and the responsibility to keep this woman in line, and they're going to do it however they see fit. They believe that their behaviors are justified. They blame, deny, they minimize, they manipulate. And so if you understand where abusers are coming from and what their motives are and why they do what they do, and you don't buy into any of these myths, then you're much more likely to understand victims. And so I think that book is really important. He has others as well. The Batterer as Parent is one of those.
Okay.
I might also mention the Stop Abuse campaign that Barry Goldstein has, and that is working. That's the one that's really working on, look at their website, trying to transform the family courts. And every year in Albany, New York, there is what's called the Battered Mothers Custody Conference. And that is where most of the experts working in this field and many, many, many victims and survivors come together for mutual learning and support to work on this issue and this problem of family courts that are tending towards siding with abusers. You know, most people think that women usually get custody of their children. And if you look at overall custody cases, this is true. And that's because most of the time it's not contested. But when it is contested, men usually win. And when they're abusers and they're using all of these tactics and they are causing systems to focus on their victim rather than on themselves, then they have a much greater likelihood of being seen themselves as a victim. That's the irony.
And you also mentioned, Julie, I think it was from I don't know what they are, but from the University of Washington, you mentioned a
Yes.
book. And what was
Yes.
the name of that book and the authors?
Yes, absolutely. When Men Batter Women by Neil Jacobson and John Gottman. Dr. Jacobson passed away, but John Gottman still does a lot of work with couples and so forth. They were sociologists. They were not planning to study domestic violence. They did a 10-year longitudinal study where they brought 200 couples into the laboratory and they hooked them up to devices that measured their heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductivity, and so forth. And as they had them discuss things and as things would get heated, they would measure what was happening in their bodies. And what they found was that, and this is so fascinating, that the abusers, that actually what they found was that in each and every one of these 200 couples, it was domestic violence. And in each and every one, the man was the abuser. They were very surprised. They didn't understand domestic violence. They ended up writing a book about domestic violence. And what they found from their physiological research was that the abusers fell out into two main groups. Ones who, the more angry or abusive they became, their blood pressure went up. The other, the more angry or abusive they became, their blood pressure went down. They called them pit bulls and cobras. And what they found out was that the cobras were the ones who were like, I don't need you, go ahead and leave me. But they were either one could kill you, but they were the ones that were probably what we would say are more sociopathic. They didn't care. Whereas the pit bulls were more like, I need you, I need you, I need you. And what would happen is the ones they called the cobras, the more violent they became, the calmer they became. This is very scary when you think about it. So, there has been all kinds of discussion and research and theorizing about abusers, and we know they're not a homogenous group, but we do know that some are more dangerous than others. And one of the things they found out, for those who were with these so-called cobras, they wouldn't leave. They knew they would be killed. But the ones who were with this other group, they were more likely to leave. Now, we know that leaving is the most dangerous thing a victim can do, at least 75% of the time, probably almost all the time. When they're killed, it's when they're leaving or after they've left. And so that's the implications for this, is that we have to listen to victims. We should never coerce them to leave. We should never have pat answers and, a 1, 2, 3, here, you need to call the police, get a restraining order, file for divorce. That kind of advice can get somebody killed. And this is why it's so important to not encourage people who don't have the necessary understanding and expertise to be advising victims. I know a lot about domestic violence. I've done that, I've been there, but I still don't give advice to them. What I do is I support them. I believe them. I tell them about all the resources, and I tell them about things that work for some, that I've seen work for some people, but I also tell them about the potential pitfalls, and I let them make their own decision, and I support them in that, even though it may not be what I think is best. But I don't get invested in the outcome of my advocacy, and I don't get disappointed if they make decisions that are counter to what I think is in their best interest. Because if I did, I would have burned out a long time ago, because it's their lives and they are the ones who have to make the decisions and live with the consequences. What I need to do is be there for them when and if, they're ready to do something different. And if they are, then I will help them. But in the meantime, I'm going to encourage them to focus on their safety and to reach out to the resources that may be able to support them and help them. So that means safety planning, which is the main thing for all victims, I think, but there are safety plans and processes for those who are going to stay with their abusers, not just those who leave. We need to not abandon victims because they choose to stay with their abusers. They need us more than ever. It's complicated, but we need to not just focus on those who have chosen to leave, because there's not good victims and bad victims. There's only victims who are trying to survive, who are doing the best they can. And we need to be there for all of them and to support them and empower them rather than try to control them, which is, what they're living with.
Right. That's so important. And I believe. We have to believe them. And I feel like for that tiny group of 2% that falsely report, it'll come out in the wash. So I always tell people, believe first first and help them.
Yeah. I wrote an article on false allegations, and I looked into it, and you're right. It is such a tiny percentage, but there is this myth out there that victims of sexual assault or domestic violence are making it up, that they're lying. But the truth is, there is very little payoff to do that, because people aren't going to believe you, and if they do, they're going to blame you anyway. And it's just not true. And that there is a certain profile of the person who makes false allegations, and that is not the profile of a victim of domestic violence.
Okay, I'm loving the conversation here. So Alicia wants to know, what are some of the things that you do for self-care? She's looking for new ideas.
Well, I'm great at talking about it and telling other people what to do. It is not easy, but I think the thing that I have done that has been the most important thing during my career is what I just said. I do not attach myself to the outcomes of the decisions that the people I'm supporting make. I don't become invested in the breakups. That if I do that, then I'm a rescuer. And if I'm trying to rescue somebody, then I'm going to get lopsided in that relationship, and they're going to end up resenting me, and I might end up feeling used by them, and it's going to get very unhealthy. There's a thing called the rescue triangle that you should look into if you're not familiar with it, or Karpman's triangle of crisis triangle, I think it's called. And if you get on what we call if you get on the rescue triangle, if you're working harder on somebody's life than they are, if you're doing more than 50% of the work, then that's your problem, and you need to back off. And this is part of learning to be an advocate. And I think, to me, that's the biggest part of my self-care. But there are other, there's more practical things that I do, of course. I had to learn to set office hours, to not be available 24/7 to people. It's hard, because you're invested emotionally in people's lives, and you learn to love some of these survivors and to get very attached to them. But if you're working harder on their life than they are, if you're laying awake at night thinking about them, or if, on the contrary, you are avoiding their calls, or they're driving you crazy, then you know that you're probably on the rescue triangle, and that there's something that you need to do for yourself. There's other practical things I do, like I garden a lot. I do art. I spend time with people who make me laugh, and with loved ones. I listen to music. Ordinarily, I would travel. That's a huge part of my self-care, but of course, that's not an option right now, unfortunately. But I do think that looking at vicarious trauma, at self-care, at compassion fatigue is very, very important. It can take a ginormous toll. And some of the best advocates I've ever known burned out like Roman candles, because they weren't able to sort of step back and look at what was happening to them. They were so giving, so compassionate, so loving. They just didn't know how to set those boundaries. So, as they say, you can't serve from an empty cup. That's a very good question. We really have to look at that. There's a great Facebook group, by the way, called Self-Care for Advocates, I believe. And a lot of ideas and mutual support is shared among advocates. You might want to join that group.
You made me think about on the airplane too. They always have you pull down your oxygen mask first before you can help someone else. So
yes, that's a really good analogy. If you have a child with you, you always put the oxygen on yourself first and not the child. And of course, your instinct is to put it on the child. But if you pass out, you can't help them. So that's a great analogy. You can't help anybody else if you're not taking care of yourself. And it's a hard lesson to learn, but there are ways that you can address compassion fatigue, because it's a huge risk in the work that we do, no matter what arena you're in. If you're working with survivors and victims, you're high risk for vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And you as an individual and the organization that you work for really needs to be looking at this and addressing this in order to be able to, take care of ourselves and also be the best we can be for those that we serve.
Julie, you said we can't serve from an empty cup, and it made me think about how you do advocacy not only in the secular sector, but also the faith-based sector. So I'm just there's no questions in the queue, so I'm gonna ask, what advice, suggestions, recommendations, whatever word fits, would you give for faith-based leaders when trying to work with survivors? Because, at least from my perspective, it is very narrow-minded in how they respond. So can you give some insight on that?
Let's see. How much time do we have?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I'm a preacher's kid.
Okay.
And so when this happened to me and my father, it happened to a man who was a very prominent pastor and biblical scholar.
Oh, wow.
So it profoundly impacted me on multiple levels. Dad sadly passed away very suddenly on Father's Day this year. But for all of these years, we have taught together, pastors, and written together and so forth, because we learned very quickly that the church, and it's not just the Christian faith, but all faiths, there's very little understanding and training by faith leaders of this. And so often what happens is we have these expectations, particularly of women, and we have these kind of rules. And the more, I guess, dogmatic or fundamental a particular sect or religion is, the more strict those boundaries are for women. And so when I work with pastors or faith leaders, if it's multi-faith, whether it's imams or rabbis or what have you, what I try to help them understand the things we've talked about, the myths and the misconceptions, to understand the difference between victims and abusers, to understand how dangerous it is to try to mandate conditions for your health, and to work with the abuser and the victim together. I think couples counseling is probably the biggest mistake and the most dangerous thing that a lot of faith leaders do, because they might be trained in counseling, but they're not necessarily trained in domestic violence per se. And you can't do couples counseling. It doesn't work. It just keeps the couple stuck. And as the abuse is increasing in frequency and severity, the victim can't tell the truth, and if she does, she gets hurt. And so helping them understand this is very critical. From the perspective of somebody who grew up in the Christian faith, the things that I talk to pastors and faith leaders about it's trying to help them understand that the things that are often used as tools to control victims are the theology that says no such thing as divorce. You can't get a divorce. That women need to submit to their husband's headship. That you must forgive. That suffering is somehow redemptive or good. These are some of the things that I try to help them understand and take back actually to the original context, and sometimes the original language of Greek or Hebrew, to understand what was really being said in these scriptures that are often used in a very simplistic way, and to advise women who are in marriages where they're being hurt physically or emotionally or spiritually, because so often they're told, go home, pray harder, you try to be a better wife, so rather than being believed and supported and keeping safety as the focus typically with faith leaders is on saving the relationship and working on that relationship, rather than looking at focusing on safety for the victim, accountability for the abuser, and safety, of course, for the children too, and then having their goal to be those things. And if there is a way that the relationship can be saved, and that can be a value, but that's not the goal. And I will tell you, I learned all this early on, literally 1989, from Dr. Reverend Marie Fortune, who has written great books, but the one that has meant the most to me, and I think so many survivors, is called Keeping the Faith, Questions and Answers for Abused Christian Women. Because I learned from her that even by filing for divorce, I wasn't doing anything that violated my Christian principles, because the marriage covenant had already been broken by my husband, by the violence and the abuse and the coercive control, that I was just simply making it public. So I think there is a lot that we can do for victims of faith to help them understand that no matter who the God is that you believe in, no God expects you to stay with somebody who is hurting you and abusing you. And so I do spend a lot of time working with those in the faith community, because I think that's where so many, if not probably the biggest group of hidden victims is. Their victims usually are isolated, and one place they do get to go a lot of times is to their house of faith. And so that's where we can reach them. And there's a lot that we can do to reach them and to send them the message that we understand, and that, this is where you can go for help. I think, sometimes you don't have to be an expert in domestic violence necessarily to help somebody, but just little things like the number of the National Domestic Violence Hotline.
Mm-hmm.
Just memorize it. And I'll tell them that 1-800-799-SAFE. My friend Ben Atherton Zeman taught me the way you remember it is 799 is one less than 800. 1-800-799-SAFE.
Oh, there you go.
So, just giving them that, they got that, up here. You don't have to remember all the numbers for all the programs, but if you know that one, 24/7 and over 150 languages, a victim could call and could find out about the resources closest to them and could talk to a trained advocate about their safety needs and so forth. So there's a lot that we can do for victims, even if we don't understand all of these complexities. We believe them, we support them, and we refer them to the experts who are going to focus on safety for the victim and accountability for the abuser. And if we do that, then we've probably done more than anybody ever has and maybe will, because our job is not to get them to leave their abusers. Our job is to support them
And to keep them
believe
safe.
them, refer them, and to be there for them each and every time they come back to us, if they do, and want help. And to stay in a place of neutrality and non-judgment and compassion. So, those are things that I think not just faith leaders need to understand, but, we all need to remind ourselves of sometimes. Because I think we put pressure on ourselves to do more.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the rescue triangle, I almost said the rescue rectangle, the rescue triangle. Yes, that's a very neat concept. I'm gonna have to look more into that myself.
The idea is that, I'll just say very briefly, it's a triangle, but it's two people that can move into different roles. Victim, not literal victim, but the victim in this relationship, if you will, the one who feels victimized, victim and perpetrator and rescuer. And it can never happen if somebody isn't trying to rescue, isn't in that mentality that, I'm here and these people are here and I'm going to help them. I have all of this good stuff for them and they're here. And if I don't think of myself as a rescuer, but rather I think of myself as a partner, and then I probably am not going to get into that headspace, and that's where we need to be. We need to do partnership with victims and survivors. And I even created a thing called the 50-50 partnership agreement when I had transitional shelters that said, here's my 50% as your advocate. Here's the 50% I'd like to see you do. If we put these together, then we'll have 100% of effort to work towards the goals that you've set for yourself. And if you see me doing any more or less than my 50%, or I see you doing any more or less than your 50%, then we agree to come together and talk about it, because we want our relationship to stay good and to not get lopsided and unhealthy. And I think, if we can just remember that we want to be partners, that our goal is empowerment and not rescuing, then I think that will go a long way towards helping us with our self-care and in doing the best we can as advocates or probation officers or social workers or pastors or whatever we are.
Julie, to stay on this faith-based track, and then Bernadette, I'll get to your question. So what you described, have you experienced any pushback? And if so, how did you handle it? And also, do you find one faith group more difficult to work with than others?
So when you say what you described, you're talking about divorce and suffering and
like how you
submission and so forth.
Correct.
It's really interesting. It's a hard question to ask. For so many years, I've talked to so many different faith leaders and people about this. I think some people are ready to hear the truth and some aren't. And my experience has been that the more fundamental, the more rigid, the more dogmatic, the more rule-based a religion or a denomination or a sect of religion is, the more in which the gender roles are very, very clearly defined and separated. The more men and women are separated, and rather than sharing in all aspects, including leadership. Those are the ones I've found to be the most resistant, because it goes against one of their basic tenets, which is the creation story and the myth that men were created to rule over women, and that men are supposed to be dominant over women. And that's another one of the scriptures that I talk about the meaning of the words and how it's been misinterpreted. For example, many of you, if you have grown up in a faith, have heard the term helpmate. And there are certain traditions that teach that men are supposed to be the head of the family, the leader of the family, and that the wife is supposed to be the helpmate. But it's not biblical. It's not in the Bible. And the word helpmate isn't even in the Bible. The word help, as it's used, Eve was a help, created to be a help for Adam, is the same word that is used for God in many places. Help, azer, is the Hebrew word. So it doesn't imply any kind of a hierarchy. And for example, the whole submission and male headship thing, again, is taken out of context and misinterpreted, because what's really being taught in the New Testament there in Ephesians is about mutual submission out of reverence for Christ. And that's actually what the teaching is. And so certain verses are cherry picked where it says, wives, submit to your husbands. Well, abusers will, pull that one out and use that one a lot, but they don't pay attention to the rest of the verse, which is husbands submit. The husbands and wives submit to each other. And just like the creation story where, the divorce issue, which usually there's a verse in the Old Testament, I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel. And that gets pulled out and given to battered women a lot, but really in that scripture, that's where that was happening. The context was, this was God saying to men who literally owned women and their children at the time, who were the only ones who actually could get a divorce, I hate what you're doing. Because what they were doing is they were divorcing, they were casting out their faithful wives and taking on foreign brides to make political allegiances with other nations. And it made the women destitute, homeless, without their children. So the rest of that verse, I hate divorce, and covering oneself with violence is the rest, and we don't hear that. So for example, so it's about, I hate violence. And when I have found that when you are able to talk in a way that is non-threatening and collegial and respectful, that faith leaders have been really open to having a discussion, a lot of them, about this. But if they aren't, then move on. Because if someone has, decided that this is what they're going to believe, and they're not willing to really look at translation of how scriptures have been translated or mistranslated or interpreted, then, we're probably not going to be able to, reach those particular folks. And this is why I think it's really important to have resources for victims and survivors from every faith arena as much as possible, so that we can refer them there and say, this is what this is what the Roman Catholic Church says. This is what the Presbyterian Church says. This is, so forth and so on. This is what the Jewish tradition teaches and so forth. And so, I mean, if you can know those things, it's great. But I think a lot of people are doing a lot of research. One of the places you can go to, and I helped develop this website, is called RAVE, the RAVE Project, RAVE, and it's www.theraveproject.com, and RAVE stands for Religion and Violence E-Learning. It was developed by Dr. Nancy Nason Clark at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, and I was one of the North American site coordinators for that project, which is funded by the Lilly Endowment. And you go on that website and everything is free and downloadable. You'll get a lot of great information. The other place is the Faith Trust Institute, which is in Seattle, and that is Reverend Marie Fortune, who I mentioned, her little book, Keeping the Faith. And they do a whole lot of training on for faith leaders, including Jewish leaders, Muslim leaders, and they also on domestic violence, sexual assault, and addressing, and also on misconduct, sexual misconduct of faith leaders and how to deal with that in congregations. So those are some really great resources for you. People who would like to have my resource lists, I have several of them, or you can also go to my website, which is domesticviolenceexpert.org. And you can contact me there, but you can find some resources there on some of these things that we've talked about. You can also find FAQs, frequently asked questions, that might be helpful.
Thank you, Julie. We might have to add minister to your long list of credentials there.
My dad would have loved that. Actually, I have a brother who's a minister and a nephew. Dad always said, you need to go to seminary. I'm like, Dad, I'm an advocate. I'm not a preacher.
You're an advocate.
You might disagree because sometimes it sounds like I'm preaching.
Well, you definitely minister through your advocacy. How about that?
Yeah, I'll take that. Thanks.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to pose Bernadette's question, and then I want to ask a question about narcissism that has come up. Okay. So Bernadette wants to know, just as I did not choose to be a victim, I did not choose to be an advocate, Bernadette says. It found me. Julie, you mentioned a quote from Oprah about change. How do you reconcile the new you?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of surrendering and letting go involved in healing from trauma. It's a process. It's not an event. I have learned and done things over the last 3 decades that I think have contributed to that, but it hasn't always been easy. It has been a process. I think one of the things for a lot of us is that we have really, we have expectations about how we should be doing. And we might judge ourselves for not being where we think we should be or doing as well as we think we should do. I think because we're so harshly treated in our abusive relationships that a lot of times, just when we are able to get out of that relationship, a lot of times it's just about really going back to ourselves and getting to know ourselves and focusing on us and what's in our long-term best interest and so forth. And it's hard to do that when you are so focused on safety and, you know, staying hidden as I was, or being stalked as I was. But my recovery has been a lifelong process, not an event, as I said, and different things have happened at different times that have changed me. You know, interestingly, I focused the biggest bulk of my career on really working for justice for victims. And my focus was on helping victims and survivors and understanding them, not on abusers, although I have an understanding that most of, well, maybe not most, but a lot of them certainly have trauma histories, and but never letting them off the hook, of course, for the choices they make, because they do make choices to do what they do. But my process has changed and evolved, and all along the way, I have had to let go and surrender ideas, beliefs, and feelings and things that didn't serve me. I had to constantly be observing myself and trying to figure out in what way and in what area I was still stuck or needed to heal, because trauma does a lot to not just our feelings, but to our beliefs. We can have some kind of distorted beliefs and some very damaged feelings. We can have trauma-related anger, trauma-related guilt. We could suffer from, the symptoms of PTSD. These are not things that are necessarily emotional or psychological entirely, because there's biology behind it. And, trauma causes us to change. The brain chemistry changes because of the rush of all the stress hormones and so forth during fight or flight. And if you live that over and over and over and over, it does change you. So a lot of, I think my healing has come about as a result of people walking with me, beside me, of being connected with other survivors, of having in the survivor support group, probably the most important thing I did, them reflecting back to me that, I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ugly. I wasn't the things that he said I was, and they weren't either. And so kind of getting my reality check back. But I had the most interesting experience about 6 years ago when my son turned 25. My estranged husband, went to prison for attempted murder of me and my dad. And I stayed hidden from him all this time. When he was released, he was paroled for several years. And I was, interestingly, contacted and called back actually to Dallas to come, because he was being tried on a subsequent case, and they were looking at a life sentence for him. And I did go and do that, and I participated, and he got a life sentence. I didn't have to face him or see him. He didn't know I was there. This was in the sentencing phase. But long story short, 6 years ago, when my son turned 25, he had been 8 months old when the divorce took place and the violence happened. He had never seen his father again, because I had to make a really horrible decision about, does he have this father in his life or does he have no father? And essentially I had to make the tough decision that we would have no contact with him. And so my father became his father figure. But I learned that David was dying in prison in a hospice. And I struggled with the idea that my son was going to never have met his father. So I was very moved to give him the opportunity to meet his father. And it's a long story. You could actually read about it on my Facebook page. I posted about it this past week. But in a nutshell, I did something that I would never recommend for a survivor to do. And I went to the prison and met with my abuser because I was taking my son to meet his father. And the shocking part of it was that he actually, I guess, because he had been held accountable in the most severe way you can, by getting a life sentence in prison and knowing he was going to die there, and by having people come to him and actually minister to him over the years, he had actually gotten insight. He was not the same person who shouted at me in court, who terrified me, who threatened me, who made who I would get calls saying that, he was going to have me killed outside of prison and so forth. And we actually had an amazing, amazing experience with him. We spent a day and a half with him. And he said to me, it was all my fault. I was mean. I was jealous. You were a great wife. And he told my son, don't be like me. Listen to your mother, listen to your grandparents. They're good people. All the things I didn't think I would hear, and that I don't think I think is very rare for victims to actually hear that. But the fact that we did, I mean, that was just another huge part of my healing that I didn't even know I needed. I was able to really extend mercy to him, if you will. Not that I ever wanted to be with him again or see him again, but that I was able to feel compassion for him, and that all of us were able to get some peace and some sense of connection. He died about 3 months later. We never saw him again, but we left that prison wearing crosses that he had made, necklaces. And, you know, it changed the end of my story. So all I'm saying is there's just no right way to do this. Victims have to listen to that inner wise voice in them. They have to believe in themselves, in their intuition, and what is in their own best interest. What works for me might not work for somebody else. And this is why I think giving advice is a very ill-advised thing to do, because I don't know what's going to help you. I only know what helped me. I can't say to you, you have to forgive, because I don't know what's best for you. But I know for me, it meant letting go, of not letting him control me anymore, of kicking him off the committee in my head. That if I had not just said, you know, if I hadn't forgiven him, which to me means I didn't deal with him. I just, in my own head, I let him go. I detached and did not let my life be dictated by what he had done to me. That was very important to me. So just having control over your healing process is so important. And there's so many different tools. I did a self-defense class that really changed my life, where I learned how to fight a padded attacker and deliver a knockout blow in 5 seconds. Many survivors wouldn't want to do that, but to me, it cured my PTSD literally in 5 days, and that was in 1990, and I'm not kidding when I say that. So there were certain things that I did that made all the difference, but I wasn't anticipating them. I didn't necessarily choose them, but they came to me. But as advocates and caring people, I think what we can say to survivors is, look, there's a whole world of things and tools and options that you have. You can try trauma therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed yoga, eye movement, EMDR. Maybe for, some victims and survivors find that using certain psychiatric medications will help treat their symptoms. For some people, prayer, meditation is very helpful. And to just basically make sure that we let them know that we honor their process, and they should honor their process, and be kind to themselves, and to not put big judgments on themselves, because there's no right way to heal. There's just your way.
Thank you so much for that touching, not story, but what you shared about your personal relationship.
Yeah, and it's not over. If you have their children, it's never over.
Right. Okay. We have 5 minutes, Julie. So,
okay.
Narcissism, your favorite word. Okay. So I know you touched on it in the podcast, but for those who may not have caught the podcast, can you just give a quick overview as to why words like sociopath, narcissism, and other labels can be detrimental to the victim healing process?
Yeah, sure. I think in my mind, from what I read and see, there's a whole lot of emphasis on narcissism, and it's domestic violence, it's intimate partner abuse, but it's not being called that. It's being defined as narc abuse, or instead of being called a domestic violence offender or abuser, he's being called a narcopath, for example. And I mentioned love bombing. what I call manipulative kindness. I think a lot of the terminology and the conflation of the issue of intimate partner abuse and what narcissists do is unfortunate, because although many abusers, certainly, if not most, have narcissistic behaviors and some beliefs, they may or may not be a full-blown narcissist, and that it should not be the emphasis anyway, because that's a mental health diagnosis. It's actually who the person is, and it's not going to change, and that's important to understand. But if we focus on that rather than on calling it domestic violence and defining it as a coercive, controlling behavior that's exercised by one intimate partner over another, and in which safety for the victim and accountability for the abuser needs to be the focus, then I think what happens is that victims get derailed and they start going off on this path, which is all about really focusing on narcissism as the problem. And if you go down that path, you'll find mental health resources and information, but you're not going to find a domestic violence advocate. You're not going to find somebody who's going to help you with safety planning. And so that is the problem that I have with it. Not because the things that are being taught about narcissists or sociopaths, if you will, or both, aren't good, and there's not good advice out there that can help a domestic violence victim. But what we need to focus on is the fact that this relationship is extraordinarily dangerous, and it will probably get more dangerous, and it's not going to end just because you decide you're going to set a boundary with a narcissist. So there's a lot of emphasis on codependency and setting boundaries and so forth. And these are not things that are helpful to a victim, typically. These are things that actually can confuse them and can shift their focus from where it needs to be in order to be as safe as they can be. So that's very much in a nutshell. I talked about it a lot more in the podcast, but I think we need to all be on the same page as a movement. We need to use the same terminology if we can, the same statistics if we can, so that we don't confuse the public. And the most important thing is always that focus on safety and accountability. And but we need to be on the same page.
Narcissism nutshell. I like it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julie. And Julie, I mean, you have just been such a wealth of information today. You're very passionate about your work. It resonates through the way you speak and how you describe things. You were very resourceful. I just really appreciate you being here today. And I'm sure the attendees.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. All of you, Sean, everybody has been great. Crew. The whole crew has been phenomenal with this conference. It has just been my pleasure and my honor to be a part of it, and I can't thank you enough. And thank you to all of you who are participating, and keep learning.
we're the ones that are honored, and there are several people in the chat who were very inspired by your story that you spoke about at the end. So
I'm happy to hear that. I will write a book, I promise.
Yeah, you have to at this point. So just a reminder to our attendees, the recording of this AMA will be posted on the conference center in a couple of days. So we're going to end it here. Julie, thank you so much. Got a lot to chew on today.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Have a great day. Join me if you want to on one of my Facebook profiles. I do a lot of discussion and
what's that?
What's there? It's domestic violence expert or violence against women expert or just Julie Owens. I have 3 different ones, and I'm also on. Yeah, so we have a lot of discussion there, and there's also some groups that folks might be interested in. So feel free to contact me if you want to.
Wonderful. Well, you have a great day, and same to the attendees. Everyone have a great day. Great and safe day.
Thank you, everyone.
All righty.